In June 1942, the Pacific Ocean changed color. After the crushing defeat at Midway, where 4 major aircraft carriers were sunk in just 2 days, Japan lost its strategic control. From Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters sought to halt the U.S. advance with a chain of defensive islands stretching from Truk and Rabaul to the Solomons, but Washington had already read that map. On the 2nd of July 1942, in a small conference room at the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the first counterattack plan. The target was an island at the southern edge of the Solomon Archipelago, where Japan was building an airstrip, Guadalcanal. According to the report of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that runway, if completed, would enable interception of every transport route between the US and Australia. Operation Watchtower, a name that sounded like a challenge, was chosen for the campaign. According to the 1st Marine Division records, 1,942, the assault force consisted of 11,000 Marines under Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, escorted by 19 transport ships, 2 aircraft carriers, and 23 escort vessels. All departed from the port of Wellington, New Zealand, on July 22. On the night of August 6, the entire convoy entered the Solomon Sea, 60 nautical miles from the target. They carried 10 days of rations, 3,000 tons of ammunition, and incomplete maps of an island few had ever seen. According to the War Department Operations Division, this was the largest U.S. amphibious landing since Veracruz in 1914. At dawn on the 7th of August 1942, the sky over Lunga Point flared with naval gunfire. Within 1 hour, more than 3,000 8-inch shells were fired onto the coastal area. When the smoke cleared, American troops surged ashore, weapons soaked in seawater, feet sinking in oil-mixed mud. They encountered little resistance. The Japanese forces on the island, about 2,200 construction workers and 600 naval troops, had fled into the jungle. According to the Marine Corps Historical Branch, the entire unfinished airfield was seized within 36 hours, on the brown gravel-mixed soil, U.S. Engineers began reconstructing the runway, naming it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a pilot killed at Midway. Guadalcanal was no tropical paradise as pictured on postcards. The island was 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, divided by mountains, rivers, and dense jungle. Humidity constantly exceeded 90%, and daytime temperatures rose above 32 degrees Celsius. Beneath the green grass lay slick clay, each step sticking like glue, according to the U.S. Army Medical Department. Within the first 3 weeks, 17% of American troops contracted malaria, 9% suffered intestinal parasites, and diarrhea cases rose 4 times higher than expected. Mosquitoes, as large as grains of rice, attacked both day and night. The river water, seemingly clear, teemed with parasites. "We fought the earth and the water before we ever met the Japanese," an engineer wrote in his diary. According to the intelligence bulletin, September 1942, the Japanese had left behind 1,200 tons of construction materials, 12 75mm guns, and 5 transport trucks. The Americans immediately used all of it to reinforce defenses around the airfield. However, Vandergrift knew well that this initial success was only temporary. The U.S. Navy was still too inexperienced for a long-range assault operation. While the troops on the island were not yet settled, on the night of August 8, a Japanese fleet departed Rabaul, moving through the New Georgia Sound. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer to strike the entire U.S. naval force anchored off Lunga. At about 1 a.m. on the 9th of August 1942, the radar aboard the cruiser USS Chicago began to jam. In the darkness, Mikawa led the formation within 9,000 yards. The Battle of Savo Island erupted. In less than 1 hour, the USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra were sunk. According to Naval Battle Report No. 23, more than 1,077 American, Australian sailors were killed, and nearly 700 were wounded. Flames engulfed the entire anchorage. At dawn, Mikawa withdrew northward, missing the chance to destroy the transport ships that had not yet unloaded. That morning, Vandegrift looked out to sea and understood that he and his 11,000 men had been left behind. Most of the food, ammunition, and equipment had not yet been brought ashore. According to the first Marine Logistics Summary, August 1942, the remaining rations would last only 12 days, and artillery ammunition reserves had dropped to 30% of the standard level. No aircraft carriers were within supporting range. "We're on our own now," he said in a brief meeting, his voice dry. The men nodded, most unaware that they had just become the first American force to face the Japanese Empire directly in a drawn-out campaign. That night, rain poured down like a warning. The canvas tents were soaked, lights were extinguished to avoid detection. In the darkness, the sounds of insects mingled with distant gunfire. A young soldier wrote in a letter to his wife, "The smell of this jungle sticks to the heart. Nothing about it is familiar, and it promises no return." According to the Vandegrift report sent to Washington, the entire force began building fortifications around Henderson Field, turning every mound of earth, every ridge of sand, into a defensive position. And in that silence, the first American war on the Pacific ground began. Guadalcanal was no longer an obscure island, but a place that challenged the entire philosophy of Japanese warfare. The numbers, maps, and orders in those early days of August 1942 marked the beginning of the 6 bloodiest months of the Pacific War, where every grain of sand, every river, and every soldier was about to enter history. After nearly 2 weeks of silence following the capture of Henderson Field, the U.S. Marines still did not know exactly how their enemy would react. Meanwhile, at Rabaul, the 17th Army Command ordered Lieutenant Colonel Kiona Ichiki, commander of the 1st Battalion, 28th Regiment, to advance toward Guadalcanal. His force numbered 917 men, transported on 6 destroyers. According to documents from the Imperial General Headquarters, 1942, Ichiki was instructed to land at Taivu Point, about 15 miles east of the airfield, and wait for the remainder of his regiment, about 1,400 men, to arrive later. But Ichiki believed he could achieve victory immediately. Before departure, he told his staff officers, "The Americans are weak in spirit. They will flee at the sight of our bayonets." From his campaigns in China and the Philippines, Ichiki had witnessed American troops surrendering in droves. He did not believe this new enemy would be any different. On the 18th of August 1942, his unit landed safely without being detected. They brought 9 70mm guns, 30 Type 96 light machine guns, and ammunition sufficient for only 2 days of fighting. According to captured document analysis number 27, the mission recorded in the operations order was to annihilate U.S. forces around the Ilu River before dawn. On the island, Lieutenant Colonel Clifton Cates, commander of the eastern sector, had already anticipated an imminent attack. A reconnaissance team from Company A, 1st Battalion, under Captain Charles Brush, encountered Japanese troops on the afternoon of August 19. In the brief skirmish, 31 Japanese soldiers were killed, and several documents were captured, including a schematic of Ichiki's force. Cates immediately reported back to headquarters. Major General Vandegrift ordered the defensive line at the Ilu River mouth to be reinforced. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell, positioned 12 Browning M1917, a 1 machine guns and 3 37mm anti-tank guns along the sandy bank, forming interlocking fields of fire. On the night of August 2021, the darkness was dense, and jungle rain fell thick as smoke. Across the river, Ichiki assembled his entire force, convinced that the Americans numbered only a few hundred exhausted men. At 0030 hours, a short bugle call sounded. More than 700 Japanese soldiers began charging across the narrow sand spit, shouting, "Banzai." According to the after-action report, 1st Marines, American fire opened when the enemy was only 50 yards away. The Browning M1917, a 1S, erupted simultaneously, firing at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. Bullets sliced through the mist, cutting into the advancing ranks. Within the first 10 minutes, hundreds of Japanese soldiers fell. The 37mm guns of D platoon fired canister rounds, each shot scattering 122 steel balls, turning the sandbank into a deadly web. When the first assault collapsed, Ichiki ordered a second charge. He believed the Americans would be stunned by the suicidal resolve of his men. But the American fire system never faltered. They never stopped firing a U.S. Marine wrote in his memoir, even when the barrels glowed red. After 6 hours of combat, the entire forward Japanese contingent was wiped out. The survivors retreated into the riverside jungle, carrying their wounded in the darkness. At dawn, Vandergrift ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart tanks waded across the river, supporting the infantry, advancing toward the opposite bank. According to the field report, 1st Tank Battalion, within 30 minutes, the tanks fired 47 37mm shells and 2,300 machine gun rounds, eliminating the remaining resistance pockets. Many Japanese soldiers hiding in foxholes were crushed under the steel tracks. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, present at the scene, wrote, "They moved among the palms, the tanks breathing yellow fire. I realized there were more bodies than trees. By noon, the battle was over. On the sandy shore, more than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead, most still wearing the insignia of the 28th Regiment." According to the Marines' casualty record, U.S. Bane's losses were 38 killed and 10 wounded. Among the bodies, the Marines found Lieutenant Colonel Ichiki, still clutching his officer's sword. Post-war Japanese documents reported that he had committed suicide after burning his unit's flag, in accordance with Imperial Army tradition. The battle lasted less than 6 hours, yet it delivered the deepest psychological shock since the beginning of the Pacific War. An internal report from the Imperial Japanese Army, dated September 1942, described the total annihilation of a unit, unprecedented in Army history. In Tokyo, news of the Battle of the Ilu River was censored, recorded only as a small unit whose whereabouts are unknown. But at Rabaul, Staff Officer Harukichi Hayakutake wrote in his diary, "Spirit cannot defeat bullets. We have met an enemy who understands industrial warfare." For the U.S. Marines, this was the first proof that defensive tactics based on interlocking fields of fire could indeed stop a suicidal assault. The Browning M1917A1S did not jam. Their water, cooled and belt-fed systems functioned continuously through the night, as described in the U.S. Ordnance Department Evaluation 1943. After the battle, Vandergrift wrote briefly in his report, "The line held, they broke on it like waves on rock. As night fell again, rain returned to the Ilu River." On the shore, the Marines cleared the battlefield, gathering the enemy's corpses into piles for mass burial. A young soldier watched the flickering flames and murmured, "They came believing we'd run. We didn't." Amid the rain and gunpowder smoke, fear transformed into clarity. Across the river, the remnants of Ichiki's unit slipped deeper into the jungle, carrying news of disaster. The Battle of Tenaru was not only a tactical victory, but also the collapse of Imperial Japan's faith in its own invincibility. From this point on, in the documents of the 17th Army headquarters, the phrase "American firepower supremacy" appeared for the first time. That turning point marked the end of the illusion of an absolute will to victory, beginning a long chain of tragedies the Japanese army would endure over the next 6 months on Guadalcanal. And in that burning dawn, the myth of invincibility died. By mid-September 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal shifted. After the disastrous defeat of the Ichiki detachment, the headquarters of the 17th Army at Rabaul decided to launch a major operation to recapture Henderson Field. According to Army Directive No. 1942/78, General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, commander of the 35th Infantry Brigade, was assigned to directly organize the counterattack. His force of 5,000 men, divided into smaller units, was transported by the so-called Tokyo Express, the American term for the nightly destroyer, based reinforcement runs. From August 29 to September 4, successive Japanese groups landed at Taivu Point, carrying light weapons, limited ammunition, and almost no artillery. Kawaguchi chose to attack from the south of the airfield, where the terrain consisted of a series of low hills linked by coral ridges. He believed the Americans would not defend there. According to the captured Japanese operations plan, September 1942, the attack was scheduled for the night of September 12, with 3 assault groups, one advancing west along the coast, one from the south, and the main force led by Kawaguchi himself moving through an 8-mile jungle trail toward the central ridgeline. On the American side, Major General Vandergrift had received an intelligence report from Scout Jacob Vauser, who had discovered a large Japanese supply depot at Tasimoko village. Based on that, he correctly predicted the direction of the attack. The responsibility for defense was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, working in coordination with the 1st Parachute Battalion. In total, 840 Marines were deployed along a 1,000-meter ridge consisting of 3 small knolls, later known as Edson's Ridge. According to the 11th Marines Fire Support Plan, the entire area was divided into 24 grid sectors, each pre-calculated with 105 mm artillery firing data. The artillery of the 11th Marines Regiment was positioned at the edge of Henderson Field, only 2,000 yards away, close enough to fire danger close if the line was breached. On the afternoon of September 12, the sky was overcast, and sea winds carried moisture into the palm groves. In the field encampment, Edson walked along the defensive line, stopping at each machine gun post to check its field of fire. He made no promises, only said quietly, "Hold this ridge, it's the key." According to the battlefield log of the 1st Raider Battalion, by 1700 hours, the platoons had completed their fortifications, erected barbed wire fences, and emplaced 18 Browning machine guns and 12 60mm mortars. Along the slopes, the Marines planted claymore mines and calculated fallback routes in case the summit was lost. At 2,130 hours, the first gunfire erupted from the west, where Japanese forward elements were probing the line. By 22:30, the entire ridge was trembling. Kawaguchi's troops stormed up the slopes, shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Under the flare-lit sky, hundreds of silhouettes surged forward like dark waves. American artillery responded instantly. According to the 11th Marines Fire Mission Report, in that first night alone, more than 2,105 mm shells were fired, many landing less than 50 meters from U.S. positions. Soil, rock, and shattered trees burst into the air, merging with the explosions into a metallic storm. By dawn on September 13, the Japanese had still failed to break through. A group of enemy soldiers infiltrated the central sector, sparking close-quarters combat. Lieutenant John Basiloni, a machine gun section officer, led a counterattack that held the middle hill. According to the Marine Corps Valor Citation, 1943, Basilone manually adjusted each Browning M1917A1 with his bare hands, though the barrels glowed red-hot, continuously feeding ammunition even after his loaders were wounded. "They came in waves," he later wrote, "and every wave broke on the same rock." By morning, more than 500 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the slopes. On the second night, September 13, Kawaguchi regrouped his shattered forces for a final assault. He ordered an all-out attack before dawn, regardless of casualties. From 0000 to 0400 hours on September 14, thousands of artillery and mortar rounds fell around the ridge. The Marines were exhausted. Many fought while dehydrated and feverish with malaria. Edson moved along the line, shouting briefly, "Stay low, keep firing." When the 3rd Japanese charge surged upward, the 11th Marines fired at point-blank range only 40 yards from the forward positions. Red flashes tore through the night as groups of Japanese soldiers fell before reaching the trenches. At 0530, Kawaguchi ordered a retreat. According to the Japanese 35th Brigade after-action report, the entire force had lost communication, with 800 and 3,850 killed and more than 1,000 wounded or missing. On the American side, the 1st Marine Division casualty summary recorded 104 killed and 210 wounded. Those stark figures reflected the difference in the two sides' combat organization. While the Japanese launched disjointed human wave assaults, the Americans fought through a tightly coordinated system linking infantry, artillery, and radio communication. The morning after the battle, Edson stood looking down the slopes where smoke still mingled with mist. He said nothing, only removed his helmet and bowed his head. In his report to Washington, General Vandergrift wrote, "The system worked. Coordination, fire discipline, and preparation saved the ridge." It was the first time the U.S. military had demonstrated the superiority of combined arms warfare, a form of combat based on inter-branch coordination. A week later, at the Henderson Field logistics base, Edson and Basilone were nominated for the Medal of Honor for their actions on the ridge. The ceremony took place in May 1943, but its meaning went far beyond personal heroism. According to the U.S. Marine Historical Division, the Battle of Edson's Ridge was not merely a tactical victory, but a turning point in how Americans understood war. They realized that the line between life and death lay within the system in data, in coordination, in rhythm. On the afternoon of September 14, the wind from the sea once again swept across Henderson Field, carrying the scent of smoke and damp earth. The surviving Marines looked toward the ridge they had just held, their eyes weary but steady. From then on, the ridge was no longer just a point on a map, it was the symbol of a new way of fighting. And in that dawn light, order defeated chaos. In early October 1942, the first seasonal rains swept over Guadalcanal, turning the dirt roads into knee-deep mud. At the same time, the Japanese command at Rabaul was preparing for its final effort to recapture Henderson Field, the key position that would determine control over the entire Solomon area. According to Operational Order No. 38 of the 17th Army, the all-out assault was assigned to General Harukichi Hyakutake, mobilizing all remaining forces on the island, about 20,000 men, with the main thrust composed of 5,600 troops from the 2nd Division under General Yumio Nasu. Nasu's objective was to break through the American defensive line from the south of the airfield and seize Henderson Field in a single night. The western wing, following the Matanikau River, was supported by Type 97 Chiha tanks and field artillery. On the American side, after weeks of preparation, the defensive system surrounding the airfield was complete. The main line, manned by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, was reinforced by the 164th Infantry Regiment, the 1st U.S. Army unit to land on the island under the XIV Corps plan. In total, the defensive force numbered more than 2,500 men, equipped with 24 105mm howitzers and 36 Browning M1917, A1 machine guns. On October 23, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick with humidity, and the scent of gunpowder. American scouts reported large movements in the southern jungle, signs that Japanese forces were massing. By 18:30 hours, U.S. artillery opened the first salvo against suspected positions. The Japanese remained silent, waiting for nightfall. At 2,200 hours, Nasu's opening bombardment began, about 150 mortars and 75mm guns simultaneously firing on Puller's line. Under the smoke, Japanese infantry advanced in waves, carrying gleaming bayonets. The force along the Matanikau River made first contact. 9 Type 97 tanks waded through the riverbed, attempting to breach the wire obstacles. According to the after-action report, 7th Marines, within 15 minutes, all tanks were destroyed by 37mm guns and bazooka fire. When the last tank burst into flames, its light illuminated the riverbank, exposing the charging Japanese formations. The machine gun platoons immediately opened fire. It was like daylight. A U.S. Marine recalled, the river was full of fire. Puller moved along the line, field telephone in hand, shouting short commands. "Hold your line! Keep them coming!" At 0030 hours, Nasu's central column launched the second assault. Around 2,000 troops advanced through the swamp south of the airstrip, aiming to strike directly at Henderson Field. However, heavy rain turned the mud knee-deep, severely slowing their progress. The Japanese artillery support lost contact due to radio failure. Meanwhile, Puller coordinated with the 111th Marines Artillery at the airfield to fire close-range barrages, each 105mm gun firing an average of 240 rounds through the night. Every round was on target, reported Battery D, 11th Marines. Explosions engulfed Japanese formations. Entire groups disappeared in the inferno. Amid that chaotic night, one name became legend: John Basilone, the non-commissioned officer in charge of the machine gun section. When ammunition ran low, he crawled through enemy fire to resupply, carrying 2 belts of 250 rounds each over his shoulders. A report in the U.S., Marine Corps Valor File 1943, recorded. Basilone crawled 200 yards under direct fire, repaired 2 machine guns, and kept the section firing for over 6 hours. He replaced hot barrels with bare hands, blood mixing with gun oil, yet kept the fire steady as a machine. Thanks to him, the central fire line held. By dawn, the entire company was still standing. On the morning of October 24, Puller inspected the field. Over 400 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the defensive perimeter, many still clutching their bayonets. By afternoon, Japanese artillery resumed heavy bombardment, marking the start of a new assault. Nasu, though slightly wounded, ordered another advance. That night, the Japanese committed all reserves, nearly 3,500 men, into the battle. Under torrential rain, they surged over the corpses of their comrades, trying to cross the trenches. Puller called for danger-close artillery fire, only 50 yards ahead. The ground exploded, trees were uprooted, and unfire merged with screams. "It was a wall of fire," one American officer recalled. By 0300 hours, the final assault had collapsed. According to the Marines Division Summary Report, October 1942, by sunrise on October 25, Nasu's entire force had been repelled. Records showed more than 2,000 Japanese dead, with hundreds of wounded left behind on the battlefield. General Yumio Nasu was killed by artillery fire while commanding near the front line. On the American side, 276 men were killed or wounded, but Henderson Field remained fully operational. That morning, the Cactus Air Force flew 19 sorties, bombing Japanese positions retreating into the southern jungle. By late afternoon, Puller stood at the edge of the runway, watching the SBD Dauntless dive bombers pass overhead. He said nothing, quietly lighting a cigarette. According to Lieutenant Thomas B. Allen, the colonel's face was calm, but everyone knew we had crossed the line. We had beaten their best. Vandergrift radioed Washington. "Henderson still ours. Enemy attack completely repulsed." That brief message concluded 3 days of fighting that decided the fate of Guadalcanal. The victory at Henderson Field did more than protect an airfield, it secured the Marines' very lifeline on the island. From then on, all resupply, support, and counter-offensives would rely on that runway. According to the Naval Intelligence Review, December 1942, failure in this battle forced the Japanese General Staff to acknowledge the loss of initiative in the Solomon sector. In reality, after the 25th of October 1942, they no longer could launch any large-scale offensive on Guadalcanal. As night fell, the aircraft from Henderson Field still growled through the rain. The surviving Marines sat around the gun pits, weapons in hand, eyes fixed on the dark jungle. In the distance, flames from burning Japanese tanks lit the horizon. A young officer wrote in his notebook, "We held the field, and maybe the war turned with it." And on that night, the tide began to change. When November 1942 began, the Guadalcanal front gradually shifted to the sea. After the disastrous defeat at Henderson Field, the Japanese General Staff understood that they could not retake the island as long as the airfield remained operational. According to Combined Fleet Operational Order No. 20, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned a full-scale campaign. The objective: to level Henderson Field with naval gunfire, ensuring the safe landing of the 38th Infantry Division, along with 30,000 tons of supplies. Yamamoto believed that a single devastating strike could reverse the entire situation in the Solomon Islands. On the 11th of November 1942, the Japanese fleet assembled at the Shortland Islands anchorage. Among its formation were the two Kongo-class battleships Hiei and Kirishima, escorted by 11 destroyers and 14 transport ships. According to the Imperial Navy operations record, the plan was divided into two phases. On the first night, the warships would bombard Henderson Field directly with 356mm shells. The next morning, the transport convoy would land troops and equipment. However, the Americans also learned of the plan through PBY Catalina reconnaissance photographs, which detected the Japanese convoy moving east toward the Solomons. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Fleet, immediately ordered a counteraction. Task Force 67, under Admiral Daniel Callahan, consisting of 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and several radar-equipped support vessels. On the night of November 12, the two fleets closed in under poor visibility. Around 1 a.m. on November 13, radar aboard USS Helena detected a large contact at 27,000 yards. Callahan gave the order to open fire before the American formation could properly deploy. In less than 40 minutes, a chaotic close-range battle erupted in the darkness. Shells, flashes, and the clash of steel lit up the sea. According to the action report, Task Force 67, the U.S. lost 2 cruisers, USS Atlanta, USS San Francisco, and 4 destroyers, Cushing, Laffey, Barton, Monson, with over 1,400 sailors killed. However, the tactical victory leaned toward the Americans when Hiei, one of Japan's 2 main battleships, was hit by 8 8-inch shells and 2 torpedoes from USS Portland. By noon, as she tried to retreat, Hiei was struck repeatedly by aircraft from the Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field and sank at 9 degrees 0 minutes south, 160 degrees 0 minutes east. It was the first time since 1905 that Japan had lost a battleship in combat. That defeat enraged but did not deter Yamamoto. On November 14, he ordered the execution of the second phase. That night, 11 transport ships carrying over 7,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and ammunition, departed for Guadalcanal, protected by a formidable escort including Kirishima, the cruisers Otago and Takao, and 8 destroyers. On the American side, Admiral Willis Lee, commanding Task Force 64, with the battleships USS Washington, USS South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, was ordered to intercept. According to the naval combat narrative, 1943, at 23:55 on November 14, Washington's radar detected enemy ships at a range of 18,000 yards. When the clock turned 0:10 on November 15, Lee gave the order to fire. Washington unleashed the first salvo from her main 16-inch, divided by 45 caliber guns, each shell weighing 1,225 kilograms. Within 6 minutes, the ship scored 9 hits, destroying Kirishima's entire bridge and command tower. Meanwhile, South Dakota was struck by 14-inch shells and temporarily lost power, but managed to withdraw from range. When the guns fell silent, Kirishima listed 30 degrees, exploded at 3:25 a.m., and sank with more than 1,100 sailors. That same night, 4 Japanese destroyers were sunk and 2 more heavily damaged. The Japanese transport convoy, now without escort, became easy prey for American air power. On the morning of November 15, SBD Dauntless and TBF Avenger aircraft from Henderson Field and USS Enterprise descended to attack. According to the Pacific Air Force combat record, 7 of the 11 transport ships took direct bomb hits, exploding or burning. The remaining 4 were destroyed by American artillery as they tried to reach the shore. Nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, most by drowning or fire. Along Guadalcanal's beaches, hundreds of burning supply drums, trucks, and field guns lit the coast for 2 days. As the sun set on November 15, the Solomon Sea grew quiet. Metal debris drifted among the wrecks. Admiral Halsey sent a brief message to Washington. Enemy defeated at sea. Henderson secured. Within 4 days, Japan had lost 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 11 transport ships, its greatest naval loss since Midway. The US lost 6 warships and 1,700 sailors, but gained complete control of the waters around Guadalcanal. On the morning of November 16, Cactus Air Force pilots conducted reconnaissance across the region, seeing only oil slicks stretching over 20 nautical miles. On the beach, Marines gazed toward the horizon, where Japanese wrecks still smoldered. A private wrote in his letter, "The sea was ours now. For the first time, we felt the war might be won." According to the U.S. Navy Intelligence Review, December 1942, the naval Battle of Guadalcanal was the event that reversed the balance of naval power in the Pacific, forcing Japan onto the defensive and restricting it to nighttime supply runs by the Tokyo Express. From then on, all Japanese resupply operations to Guadalcanal were confined to the brief hours of darkness when American aircraft could not operate. The loss of daylight control turned them into prisoners of the very ocean they once ruled. Henderson Field was secured, and from its runway, an average of 120 sorties per day took off, sweeping away the remnants of the Imperial Navy from the Solomons. Guadalcanal was no longer a battle of jungle and mud, but a war of waves and steel. In the sound of the night wind passing through the wrecks, a new era began, an age where radar, coalition, coordination, and sea power would determine the fate of empires. And on that sea of fire, Japan's power finally broke. As the gunfire on the island faded after the naval battles of November 1942, another enemy began to take shape. It was not artillery or torpedoes, but weather, insects, and hunger. According to the medical department of the U.S. Army, Report No. 241943, by the end of November, more than 8,000 American Marines of the 1st Division had contracted malaria, 27% of them with multiple relapses. However, thanks to supplies of quinine, Atabrine, and regular rotation, they maintained 70% of their combat effectiveness. On the opposite side, the situation was entirely different. Documents captured from the 17th Army headquarters revealed that by December 1942, over 60% of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal had lost combat capability due to disease and malnutrition. A report by Imperial Army Surgeon Major Kenzo Tamura, discovered after the war, stated briefly, starvation, malaria, dysentery, pneumonia. 30% of the troops can still hold a rifle. Within 24 hours, an average of 50 Japanese soldiers died, not from bullets but from exhaustion. This condition began after the Battle of Henderson Field, when the Japanese Navy lost control of the surrounding seas. Resupply was only possible at night via the Tokyo Express destroyer runs carrying a few tons of hard rations, some artillery shells, and almost no medicine. According to the Combined Fleet Logistics Log, November 1942, each Japanese soldier received an average of 180 grams of rice per day, less than 1/3 of the minimum ration. On many days, entire battalions were issued only salt and tea. Meanwhile, the Americans ate canned meat, oatmeal, and hard biscuits. According to the Quartermaster Report, U.S. 1st Marine Division, food reserves at Henderson Field in early December totaled 560 tons, enough to feed the troops for 45 days without new supplies. The contrast between the two systems became stark. One lived on an industrial supply network, the other on sheer willpower. In the jungles south of the Matanikau River, surviving Japanese units had to forage. Entries from the Japanese 2nd Division Field Diary describe soldiers digging wild tubers, picking unripe fruit, and boiling tree bark to soften it. A short note dated December 7 read, "Today, 3 men died from eating poisonous mushrooms. We no longer feel hunger, only a heavy head." In makeshift shelters of palm branches, Japanese medics dressed wounds with cloth torn from uniforms. With no quinine left, they mixed salt water from the rain. When wounds were too severe, unit officers handed each man a Type 97 grenade. According to the post-war testimony of Corporal Minoru Tanaka, we called it the final painkiller. That scene repeated throughout Guadalcanal's jungles. Young soldiers, feverish and trembling, pulling grenade pins before fading away. Footage filmed after the war showed mass graves near Taivu Point, mostly skeletal remains beside empty canteens. Japan's logistical system collapsed for reasons that could not be repaired in time. According to the Imperial Navy Transportation Analysis, 1946, from September to December 1942, Japan conducted 39 Tokyo Express runs, but only 26 succeeded, each delivering an average of 300 tons of cargo, less than 1/10 of the 17th Army's minimum requirement. Most shipments were sunk by US bombs or dumped overboard to avoid detection. Meanwhile, on the American side, the US Naval Supply Depot Noumea operated continuously, sending 5,000 tons of supplies each week to the island, including fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical equipment. In early December, the U.S. Army Medical Department established Field Hospital No. 4, capable of treating 800 patients, equipped with plasma transfusion machines, sulfur drugs, and Atabrine for malaria. Army physician William Taliaferro, in his report to the War Department, noted that 1 in every 2 soldiers had contracted illness but continued normal service. The mortality rate from disease among U.S. forces was under 1.2%, compared with 29% on the Japanese side. According to the Japanese Army Medical Bureau Summary, 1943. At the field aid station near the Lunga River, makeshift wooden operating tables stood under oil lamps as the scent of ether and gunpowder smoke mingled in the air. The Japanese had no such scene. In the medical memoirs of the 17th Army, a military doctor wrote, "We have no medicine, no bandages. Wounds rot, flies swarm. 1 wounded man means 3 must leave their posts." By mid-December, effective manpower was down to 30%, but the order to retreat had not been issued. Scattered battalions around Mount Austin survived on rainwater and insects. A Japanese prisoner interrogated on December 19 said, "We shared rice water, 1 spoon for 3 men. Ugh." In post-war American reports, the phrase systemic collapse appeared for the first time to describe this situation. The Japanese logistical structure lacked intermediate nodes. Every supply route depended entirely on the Navy. Once sea control was lost, the entire army on Guadalcanal was cut off in total isolation. The collapse did not come with explosions, but with the silence of malaria, the sound of coughing, and the faint breath of the dying. They died standing, waiting for food that never came, quoted the U.S. Marine Intelligence Report. January 1943. On the other side, the Americans also suffered from mold and disease, but their system continued to function. Soldiers rotated to the rear for rest. Uniforms were washed with gasoline and smoked to kill mosquitoes. Each morning, medics issued 1 0.1 gram Atabrine pill per soldier. According to the Field Preventive Medicine Report, this measure reduced malaria relapses by 40% within 3 weeks. U.S. Troops called Atabrine the yellow miracle, the yellow pill that turned their skin color but kept them alive. Behind Henderson Field, transport ships docked regularly, each carrying 400 tons of medical supplies and rations. In the warehouses, crates were marked "From San Francisco," with care. It was the emblem of a vast industrial system that never stopped, where every bullet, can of milk, and bottle of medicine was precisely accounted for. According to Naval Supply Division statistics, the loss rate of goods during transport was only 0.7%, while Japan lost over 60% of its materials en route. By late December 1942, when General Hyakutake received his final medical report, he understood that the battle had ended without another shot being fired. His army was disintegrating in biological terms. The report read, "No beds for the sick, no men left to bury the dead, dampness and the stench of corpses." At the same time, the Americans were planning a general offensive for early January. The difference was no longer in spirit, but in systems. In a wartime film shot at Henderson Field, American Dr. Taliaferro looked toward the distant jungle and murmured, "We fight diseases as much as men." That sentence captured the essence of modern war. Guadalcanal proved that weapons do not decide everything. Logistics wins wars not by speed, but by sustaining life in the dark. By the end of the year, statistics from the U.S. Pacific Command showed 13,762 American soldiers treated and recovered in the field. Japan lost over 10,000 men to hunger, disease, and exhaustion. As the final sun of 1,942 set over the Solomon Sea, no gunfire remained, only the smell of wet earth and ash. In the silence, the logistical system of an empire collapsed, and with it, the illusion that willpower could feed an army. And in that silence, the empire began to die. In January 1943, when the Guadalcanal battlefield was exhausted after 6 months of fighting, the Japanese General Staff understood that they could no longer hold the island. The Navy had lost control, the Air Force had been pushed back from Rabaul, and General Harukichi Hyakutake's remaining troops were on the brink of collapse. According to the Imperial Army Operations Record, 1943, Japan's initial strength on Guadalcanal was 36,000 men. By January, only 11,000 remained alive, most of them emaciated, malarial, or starving. Instead of continuing a suicidal defense, the Japanese command devised a secret withdrawal plan codenamed Operation KE, a campaign later regarded as their final success in the entire Pacific theater. The plan was drafted at Rabaul on the 15th of January 1943, under the direction of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and General Hitoshi Imamura, aiming to evacuate all remaining forces from the island within 3 nights using high-speed destroyers. According to the Combined Fleet Staff report, the task was assigned to Destroyer Squadron 10, comprising 20 destroyers rotating between Shortland and the western coast of Guadalcanal. From February 1 to 7, the runs were executed with extraordinary precision, each taking only 4 hours to enter and exit enemy waters. On the night of the 7th of February 1943, the final evacuation was completed, extracting 10,652 men from the island. Simultaneously, American forces advanced into abandoned positions, unaware that the enemy had already gone. Yet the numbers told the scale of the disaster. According to the U.S. War Department Statistical Digest, 1,945, out of 36,000 Japanese soldiers, about 14,800 were killed in combat, and 15,000 died of disease, starvation, or exhaustion. In other words, only 3 out of every 10 who came to Guadalcanal ever left it. On the American side, during the campaign from August 1942 to February 1943, 1,600 were killed, 4,200 wounded, and about 8,000 treated for illness on site. The Japanese-American casualty ratio, estimated at 15-1, was a brutal reflection of the gap in organization, logistics, and medical capability. Behind those figures lay a profound strategic shift. Guadalcanal was not merely a battle, it was a measure of national capacity. Japan had entered the war believing that the Bushido's spirit and personal valor could compensate for material deficiencies. Guadalcanal proved the opposite. According to the post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific, 1946, this was the first time Japanese forces had failed in a prolonged campaign not due to loss of morale, but the collapse of their system. When logistics could not be maintained and replacement mechanisms failed, all courage dissolved. General Hyakutake wrote in his 1947 memoir, "On that island, we lost the belief that men could triumph over machines. For the United States, Guadalcanal was the most decisive strategic turning point since Midway." According to the U.S. Navy Pacific War Review, 1944, after securing full control of the island on the 9th of February 1943, the Allies officially seized the initiative in the South Pacific. From Henderson Field, U.S. air operations expanded toward Bougainville and Rabaul, gradually severing Japan's supply lines through the Solomon Chain. It was also the first time in history that the Army, Navy, and Air Force of the United States coordinated in a campaign lasting more than half a year. The result of that cooperation was summarized in Joint Chiefs of Staff Memo 213/1943. Guadalcanal has proven that integrated operations, sustained by logistics, determine victory. The strategic shift was evident in how the US reorganized its entire war apparatus. The doctrine of combined arms and logistics warfare was born directly from the lessons of the island. Officers who had fought on Guadalcanal, such as Vandergrift, Puller, and Edson, emphasized that victory came not from spirit but from mastery of the supply chain. According to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Review 1947, concepts such as fire coordination grid, inter-service communication, and supply line redundancy were first systematized into doctrine here. Every subsequent operation, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, ran on principles drawn from Guadalcanal. Logistics are the backbone of modern war. For Japan, the memory of Guadalcanal became an unhealed wound. In post-war interrogations, many officers admitted they had underestimated American industrial capacity. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had served as a staff officer of the 2nd Division, wrote in his 1951 memoir, "We carried spirit, they carried a system. When the spirit failed, the system kept running." Later, Japanese historians would describe Guadalcanal as the end of the offensive war and the beginning of the long retreat that lasted until 1945. The campaign's influence extended far beyond military realms. In the United States, it became a symbol of recovery after the dark months of 1942. Articles in Life and Time magazine called Guadalcanal the proving ground, the place where the Marines learned to turn war into science. Photographs of smiling Marines beside the Henderson Field runway, with the smoke of a B-17 rising in the background, were printed across America as proof that victory was no longer a matter of faith, but of organization. Academically, American war colleges later regarded Guadalcanal as the classic example of systems warfare. According to the Naval War College curriculum, 1952, the decisive factor in the campaign was not combat tactics but control over information, energy, and materiel. The success of the Cactus Air Force, a fusion of diverse aircraft, pilots, and a unified command structure, became the foundation of the modern joint operation concept. Meanwhile, Japan failed to adapt to the industrial mode of warfare, maintaining a fragmented command structure with little coordination between the Army and the Navy. By the 1962, as historians re-examined World War II, Guadalcanal was seen as the definitive lesson in the collapse of courage-based warfare. It was not courage that failed Japan, historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote. It was arithmetic. The figures of Guadalcanal, 36,000 versus 11,000, a 15-to-1 ratio, and 6 months of combat became symbols of an era where data and logistics determined outcomes. On the afternoon of the 9th of February 1943, when General Alexander Patch sent his famous message, "Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal," the campaign officially ended. But its legacy endured in every modern conflict, from the beaches of Normandy to the deserts of Kuwait, where logistics and technology became the decisive elements. Guadalcanal taught mankind that war is not a contest of bravery, but a test of organizational capacity. On the island, the forests have turned green again. Shell craters have become ponds, and the Henderson runway is now a commercial airport. Yet when the wind passes through the palms, one can still imagine the hum of engines from the past. In that moment of silence, the lesson of Guadalcanal remains. Victory does not belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who can sustain the rhythm of an entire system. And in that rhythm, modern war was born.